HMS Ajax, and I know some people call it Ajax, but I asked two Greek university students and they ended up in a screaming match with one picking each side, so I'm calling it Ajax because that's what I grew up with. Anyway, Ajax was one of the first batch of Leander-class cruisers, laid down in February 1933, launched in March 1934 and commissioned in June 1935. As with most of her class, she was supposed to take up service on distant stations during peacetime, but was still in the UK when the Abyssinian crisis blew up, and so she spent her first few years of service in the Mediterranean instead. After a refit that doubled her heavy anti-aircraft armament by switching her single 4-inch guns for twins, she headed for her originally planned station in the West Indies and was still in the Southern Atlantic when war broke out in 1939. A few months mopping up rogue German shipping then ensued until the Admiral Graf Zeppelin popped up in the area. Then Ajax joined her sister Achilles, the County-class cruiser HMS Cumberland and the York-class heavy cruiser HMS Exeter to form Force G. Cumberland was making repairs at the Falkland Islands when the rest of the force found Graf Zeppelin and the Battle of the River Plate ensued. The force split up, with Exeter engaging on one side and the two Leanders on the opposite side. Ajax launched its float plane to help spot the fall of gunnery and blazed away with her 6-inch guns. Although these made relatively little impression on the belt and turret armour of her adversary, they, along with the guns of Achilles, proved very useful in breaking all sorts of important things that weren't the ship's main battery or belt armour, and would also both distract Graf Zeppelin at various points, as well as force it to engage them instead of the now crippled Exeter. Ajax would also launch torpedoes to further dictate the larger German ship's actions by forcing her to evade, receiving an 11-inch shell hit in return that knocked out the aft superfiring turret and also jammed the lower turret aft, followed by another hit to her mast. All told, this resulted in 7 killed and 5 wounded men, but the battle would force the Graf Zeppelin to seek shelter whilst Cumberland arrived to take the place of Exeter. After a successful British intelligence operation led Captain Langsdorff to believe a battle cruiser and a carrier waited for him along with the 3 cruisers, the Graf Zeppelin was scuttled and Ajax headed south to refuel and repair at the Falklands before resuming her patrols of the southern Atlantic. She would subsequently return to the UK along with a small task force that accreted over the journey, and would spend most of 1940 in refit, which included improvements for the anti-aircraft battery and a shiny new Type 279 multifunction radar. With German raiders something less of a threat and Italy having declared war, she was sent to the Mediterranean, albeit via the long route heading around Africa, escorting various convoys to wind up in Alexandria via the Suez Canal. Operating with both Cunningham's main fleet and on more detached duties alongside her sisters and half-sisters such as Orion, Neptune and Sydney, she covered Allied convoys and hunted Italian ones, during the course of which she ran into a force of 4 destroyers and 3 torpedo boats whilst on scouting duty. Despite missing the approach of the 3 Speaker-class torpedo boats initially, and thus their being able to launch both a torpedo and gun assault at surprisingly close range, Ajax was able to evade the torpedoes and then close in with all guns blazing, sinking 2 of the 3 torpedo boats with rapid 6-inch salvos. The new radar then picked up the destroyers, and so Ajax went after them as well, evading even more torpedoes and crippling a destroyer whilst badly damaging another. The crippled vessel would later be picked off by HMS York. In return, Ajax was hit by a number of 100 and 120mm shells, and has actually ended up taking 3 times as many casualties as she had in her fight with Graf Zeppelin, requiring about a month in harbour for repairs afterwards. Bombardment missions and more convoy escort and convoy attack duties would follow, including the complete destruction of a small Italian convoy on the 12th of November 1940. 1941 was less kind, seeing her hit by dive bombers whilst helping to evacuate Crete, before fortune turned again and she covered the neutralising of Vichy French Syria before being deployed to Malta for further commerce raiding until, heavily worn out by damage and operations, she was recalled to the UK, again via the long route around Africa, for a heavy refit in February 1942. This would last quite a while, introducing a number of 20mm cannon, numerous new radars, and removing her aircraft launching facilities and hangar in exchange. By the end of the year, she was getting used to being back in action on the familiar convoy radar and defence duties, this time in the Western Mediterranean, when she took a hit from a 1,000-pound bomb and was sent to the USA for repairs. This involved replacing some of her new radar with even newer versions, as well as the deployment of 40mm Bofors guns, largely replacing the 20mm Oerlikons and any remaining machine guns. This then brought her back into service just in time to prepare for and take part in the D-Day landings, where she provided fire support, and then repeated the trick in Operation Dragoon, the invasion of southern France, as well as the reoccupation of Greece. Post-war, in subtle irony, she would bring the surviving crew of Graf Spee back home before being assigned back to the Mediterranean, where she was involved with the various, and at times highly distasteful, naval incidents that surrounded attempted immigration to the then territory of Palestine prior to the formation of the modern state of Israel. Sales to the Chilean Navy fell through in 1948 due to interference by Churchill, and instead she was sold for scrapping in 1949.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.